There we go. Can you hear me, George?
Yes, we're good to go.
Cool. So it sounds like the recording is going. Cool. So Sarah mentioned we're going to try to keep you awake for the next handful of hours. I don't think that's going to be a problem because data reduction is the most exciting thing we're probably going to do all day. I know everybody always looks forward to data reduction. You're running the mass spec and I can't wait to spend weeks reducing data. So we're going to take seconds to reduce it and then start looking at fun plots. I always find this to be super fun, but I'm super nerd, so maybe data reduction to me is a little more exciting than to you. Try to keep your socks on. So cool. So it sounds like everybody's good with running the programs. John, you're getting the compiler, but you have the tiny computer to work on. It's going to look funny on that tiny one. Anybody else having issues? Everybody took off to lunch, and so it seems like we should be good to go. So yeah, I'm going to go over using HCalc first. So this is a data reduction program that it's basically a MATLAB version of what George and several other folks over years and years of work had built themselves. So I basically am standing on their shoulders in building this program. They spent from the patent days of IOLite, which is still a program, but it costs some money to use, through to HCalc, which is what George and many others in the LAICPMS working group developed over the years. It does all of the same math. There's nothing new about this really, other than its fancy interface. So I just want to pour that on you that like I did not figure out all of this math just by working as a postdoc for a few years. No way. This is really, it's kind of decades of work actually that go on under the hood. And so speaking of under the hood, let's talk about that. This code and all of the code that any code that I've written or I've been involved in, I make it a point to be open source. I think that's really productive. I have no monetary interest in anything really, especially academics. So this is all on my GitHub. You have probably a link to this in some of the documentation. It's just GitHub and then my name spelled out. But all of this is on here. So for example, if you really wanted to know what's going on under the hood for the E2 data reduction, it's a little messy, but if you're really curious, you can always send me an email and I can point you to exactly where the math happens. But it's all in there, and the idea is to be transparent. That's another big thing that, working with George over the years and just being a part of LaserCon, that's what we're all about. Just full transparency. Like there's no like secrets about anything. This is, we're chatting during the break. We're talking about robustness of ages. There's a lot of knobs you can turn, and Sarah went over some of the details. It's really kind of hard to tinker with the age too much, I've found. I've played a lot with data reduction and written a lot of code. It's honestly like uranium lead is a pretty robust system. It's hard to turn your ages one way or the other. So that helps me sleep at night, honestly, when I build like a reduction platform and people are, publishing theses and papers on it. So keep that in mind. There are a lot of bells and whistles, a lot of knobs, a lot of caveats to all of this stuff. But at the end of the day, we're within 1% to 2%, and if you're doing detrital geochron, then hey, that's great, right? Anyways, that was more of a preamble than I had planned. But yeah, it's all open source. It's all here. If you ever have questions about it, please reach out. I love nerding out on data reduction. So cool. So I'm going to walk through this as slowly as I think, or I'm going to like keep looking up to make sure people aren't like scrambling. But if I get going really fast, seriously, just slow me down. Throw something at me if I get way into the weeds. Yeah, they can be roaming. So yeah, definitely, if I'm going too fast, that's going to be the biggest problem that, other than, yeah, diving into too many weeds, but I'm going to try to avoid both of those things. So, yeah, go ahead and open up HCalc if you don't have it open already. These are deployed as individual graphical user interfaces or GUIs, right? You can also run this stuff if you have a copy of MATLAB. You can always just run it from the code. If you don't have to know anything in a command line interface, any coding interface. You don't need to know anything about coding to run this in MATLAB. So don't be afraid. If I know I was afraid when I first started Googling how to plot things in MATLAB. But yeah. So today I'm going to try to use the mouse as my pointer so that folks who have joined us virtually can see what I'm actually doing. So we're going to use this one right here, this uranium, thorium, lead time resolved. The way this interface is set up is, so on the left, top left here is the new plasma. That's the multi-collector that Mark talked about. On the right here is the element 2. This only has a single reduction that does a whole bunch of stuff like trace elements, uranium, lead. Down here on the bottom left, there's some acquisition tools, so setting up scan lists, things that facilitate what we do in the lab. We're not going to really touch on these at all. And then there's a bunch of analysis tools, so plotting concordias and plotting age distributions, stacking a bunch of age distributions to kind of see where the peaks align and if they do or not. Weighted means, just kind of general things that Sarah has already talked about and Blair has talked about. But let's start with data reduction though. So that's going to be here. This just click it one time. If you click it a bunch of times, it'll open as many times as you click it. So be careful of that. And you should see this general interface, just a blank interface with a bunch of blank plots. I'm seeing some nods. Sarah can give me thumbs up from behind you, should be lurking ominously. Not ominously, of course. Let's get rid of this floating thing. Hide meeting controls. Let's put George. George can live down here with all of the virtual folks. Okay, cool. So a blank interface, right? And so what we're going to load, I'm going to go back to my desktop here for just a sec. I have all of the data in this folder here for all of the different exercises we're going to do today. I'm seeing some nods. Yeah, you have the data. If you don't, Sarah can get it for you. What we're going to load in first is a folder with a couple of different types of information. And so I'm just going to open up the data and show you what the data look like real quick. It's going to be really tiny and small, but I'm going to explain it. And so all of this stuff is extra. This gets produced when you do the actual run. So as Sarah mentioned, you buy a mass spectrometry, you buy a laser system, you spend all this money, and they don't know how to talk to each other. And it's a huge struggle. Every lab I've ever worked in or seen, it's always two separate monsters, right? So getting these things to communicate, it's actually not super necessary in most cases. On the multi-collector, they don't communicate at all the way we're running it now. So what you're going to load in is a scan CSV, that's your laser file, and then a run file, that's the mass spec. And so the scan CSV, Dan showed some of this. This is kind of a text version of what Dan showed. And it's just sample after sample after sample after sample, and it just goes on and on and on and on. And this just tells the laser where to go, drive around, how long to shoot, how big of a laser beam to shoot it, shoot the zircon. That's all this scan list does. So when you go picking your spots, this is what you're actually programming, is this monster text file. So the data reduction needs that. And then it also needs the isotopic data, the mass spec data, which is just another lovely string of numbers. And this we run in time resolved analysis, which I'm going to talk about very briefly, or actually we're going to kind of see it plotted up. But it's basically, this is just a long string of different isotopes. So the leftmost column is 238, then 232, and so on until we have time. And just a long string of numbers. And so what the reduction does is it takes this mess of numbers and makes some sense of it. Okay, so go ahead and click on the select input folder. So we're going to bring in that entire folder. So I'm going to navigate to it and pause. So it lives here in the data reduction. And I'm just going to click on the folder and not navigate into it. So this might be a little grainy for those who are in person, but it's the one that just says CP40 120 analyses per hour. So find that folder, select the folder, but don't go all the way into the folder. If you go all the way in, you'll notice that you can't actually do anything. Like you can't select these files because the program wants the folder. Because it needs both, it needs access to both of the types of information, the laser data and the mass spec data. For those who already have it, hang with us while everybody gets caught up. If you're already there, you can go ahead and click on open. So select the folder only and click on open. So yeah, we are, oh, for HCalc ML, we are using new and uranium, thorium, lead, time resolved. Okay, data folder, it's going to be, so I have it in a separate folder of input data, and then the one that says HCalc ML, data reduction. Okay, so now we'll hang tight, but if you're feeling daring, you can go ahead and click on reduce data. And then sometimes it'll take, depending on the operating system, it'll take either a couple of minutes or it'll take a couple of seconds, depending on what system you're running. It's basically crunching through the code. Seeing somebody giggling, hopefully it's not at me. It's a minutes type. We got a minutes type deal over here. I brought a few different machines, so I know which ones are faster. But be patient with it, depending on your operating system. Eventually, you should see something like this, where basically all of the empty plots are now full of stuff that actually should look pretty familiar after Sarah's presentations, right? Reduce data. So there's this long-standing joke I have with a PhD student I worked with as I was doing my PhD. It's like, man, your program's broken. I can't figure it out. Like, did you click on the giant reduce data button? And it's like, ah, I hate you so much. So every time, so I actually made him a version where I took this button and made it the entire site. Like Tyson, not to mention names. Like, here, did you find the reduce data button? So yeah. Maybe a show of hands, who has plots? I see plots. John's got plots. He's got plots. Anybody not have plots? No plots. Okay, that's about 30%. Real slow. Let's take our time. Let the food settle right after lunch. So if they crash and burn, we can figure out maybe afterward why. I do have a couple of extra computers. If anybody wants to use them, I have a Mac and a PC. So by all means, have at it. Just don't delete my proposals, please. Okay, I'm gonna hang tight here. Getting there. Sarah, you give me a thumbs up. Maybe you can. Okay, we got about a half a thumb. Yeah, the second time you do it, the first time you ever open one of these programs, what it does, so I've been told, is it finds the compiler on your computer, which is basically the engine. It's the runtime compiler that you downloaded. Everything has a runtime, like Java has a runtime. You know, all of these things have a runtime. The engine that actually runs the program. And so this engine is actually all of MATLAB. So it's a big engine. That's why the compiler took so long to download. But yeah, the first time it has to find that and then connect to it and navigate all this stuff, and it just doesn't show you that it's doing anything, for better or for worse. And so yeah, the second time it's usually a lot faster. Hmm. Wait, do you have it working? Is it working for you? Okay. Well, you did run it already. You ran it yesterday. Okay. Cool. If you want to catch, you can catch these two computers up and maybe pass them along. That could, the password on the Mac is space. It's really a terrible idea. Anyway, so let's move on. I'm going to basically walk through each of these panels one by one. So I'm going to walk through each of the panels, and each of these panels should be really familiar at this point, right? So let's start with the very top. So you have the reduce data button, which you did. Up here is a string of text that tells you which file that you're actually you actually loaded, or really folder. And then in these boxes, it's going to be really small for folks looking on the screen, but if you do have it in front of you, these are all of the filters. These are the big decisions that Sarah was talking about making. Like, okay, well, where do I place that best age cutoff between, you know, my more precise and accurate 6-8 ages for young ages and my 6-7 ages for old? By default, we set it to 900 million years because for whatever paleogeographic reason, there's not a lot of igneous activity at that time. So it's a natural lull in the amount of, you know, it's not the middle of the Grenville, which is basically like 1,000 to 200 or 1,200 million years. You don't want to place your best age cutoff right in between that, because there's going to be this artificial shift in how precise and accurate your dates are. Sarah brought this up right when everybody came back. So that's what this one is. So we set it at 900 by default, but if you somehow have a lot of 900 million year grains or anything around that, you want to move that, right? You want to move it to somewhere that is where you don't have a lot of dates. So the discordance cutoff, that's the next one moving. I'm just going to move from left to right and chat about these just very briefly. So the discordance transition. And so what this is we apply a discordance filter based on a percentage, which is a couple of these other boxes, for dates that are older than 600 million years. The reason we don't do it for younger than that is because discordance is how different are your 6-8 versus 6-7, right? Remember that plot where the 6-7 uncertainty just exploded? It's just not a reliable chronometer once you're younger than roughly 600. 600 just, it's an arbitrary number, sure. There's some really cool research coming out right now by Chris Spencer and his group on what is maybe a different way to approach this topic. So this is an active field of research. Most people, and myself included, just choose a hard cutoff, but there are other ways to do it. And so Chris Spencer, Steve Pletz, these other folks just put out a paper this year or a couple of months ago talking about this very thing with a global database. So, but for this program, we have just a hard cutoff. Uncertainty. So this one, this third box here is 6-8 uncertainty, so 206, 238, right? So anything greater than 206, 238 uncertainty of 10%, it's quote rejected. It's not deleted forever. It's in your kind of detailed table, as you'll see, but it's as your final result of what you make your, say, probability distribution or your kernel density estimate, whatever you're doing, it's not included in that simple table. The next box is just for 6-7, the same idea, 10% uncertainty, 20% uncertainty, whatever you know, for reasons that Sarah went over. If you have a bunch of really old ages, you don't want to have a very tight filter because that might be valuable information, right? Discordance cutoff. So we talked about that, everything older than 600 million years. The discordance cutoff, we set it at 20%. That's actually a pretty loose filter. So everything that has a discordance or a difference in those two, with the two watches, right? Your 6-8 watch and your 6-7. If it's 20% different and it's older than 600, you kick it out, right? You don't delete it forever. You always report it, but you don't use it in your interpretation for, again, reasons that Sarah talked about. Reverse discordance cutoff, that's usually a tighter filter. It's harder to have dates that are reverse discordant. It's easy to have lead loss. It's hard to get on the other side of that Concordia plot. There's sometimes you'll see in publication, they'll say not on Earth or something like that. It's kind of a no-go zone. It's really hard analytically, and it's really hard geologically to produce a date or produce a zircon that will produce that date. So that's usually a tighter filter because usually it's something analytical or something suspect with the material. This 600 right here, this is counts per second of 204. Anybody, why would 204, why would we want to avoid anything with a ton of 204 in it? Yeah. Yep, so for the virtual folks that can't hear, the in-person folks, yeah, because there's way too much common lead, initial lead, or background lead, a lot of ways to say it, right? So those would be suspect grains, right? If you have a lot of initial lead, you know, you might be biasing your age that way. So anything with a lot of common lead will be kicked out. This can also lead you to find out that, hey, the sample puck might be even dirty because there's lead everywhere. Like Sarah said, you don't go to the gas station before working in a TIMS lab. That's like, no. Remember one of my committee members, he ran the lab and he said, if you bring one sand grain into my lab, I'm done for. And so I never went into his TIMS, I never went into his clean lab. But yeah, it's really high precision stuff. For us, it can be a little sloppier. The labs are still very, very clean, but nothing like an ID TIMS lab. But this is a way to account for dirty pucks as well. Like if you have one little piece of pyrite and you sand, you polish your mount, that's enough to completely throw off your entire analytical session because of the common lead. So this is a way to monitor for that. 6.4 factor, we just set it to 1. That basically applies what Sarah mentioned earlier, that Stacy Kramer's regression. This is kind of a knob on Stacy Kramer's. If you ramp this up to a really high number, it effectively turns your common lead correction off, which if you're looking at apatite, titanite, you might want to do that. Or calcite for that, definitely calcite. And then uranium concentration, again, if you have really hot zircons, they might be susceptible to more common lead or more lead loss rather. And so you can filter for that. Okay, so that was a lot of talking about a lot of tiny boxes. How are people doing on the programs or things? Nothing for a couple. Okay, I'm seeing more nods than not. Okay, more nods than shakes. So I'm gonna, Sarah, can you keep on with that? There's one extra computer up here that folks can use. Oh gosh, so that one's, oh no, right, that one. Yeah, cool. So I'm gonna move on to, so there's a couple of other general things you can do in this program. You can select a variety of different standards. We use FC1 as our primary and R33 as our secondary. Dan kind of talked about standards. You can do some outlier rejection. We'll touch on this in a few minutes. Then there's some saving options. If you don't want to interrogate your data too much, you just want the answer, you just hit save now, go home, kind of wash your hands, you're done. But that's not what we're all about, right? We're going to dive into our data. So one of the things that Sarah talked about was sample standard bracketing. So that's what's shown here in this big plot here. And I made this plot huge in the program on purpose because it's super important, especially for 206.238. So by default, 206.238 is plotted. So if you look at 206.207, you can click on that button. That should generally be flatter and generally be closer to 1. Remember, 206, 207, they look really similar to a mass spec. They behave in a similar way. They hit the multi-collector at the same general area, right? You know, you're not on one side of the Faradays versus another. So your fractionation factor should be pretty low, right? And so, or pretty much close to 1, because they're not going to vary very much. But that 6.8, it's going to vary a lot. So this is telling us, you know, assuming that we have our reference materials are correct, that we're measuring 1.12 of the true age of each of these zircons. And so we're basically normalizing to what we measure for the standard. So the blue diamonds here, I should note these little tools in the top left, this little magnifying glass, these are kind of interactive tools. You can use these to on any of these plots in the program. So here's an example of what Sarah was talking about. She had a more schematic version of it. Basically, you have a diamond, right? That is a standard. And then you have a blank, 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 blank. That's 5 unknowns, and then another standard. And then 5 unknowns, another standard, and so on. And so again, the fractionation factor is about 1.12. So that tells us how, Mark mentioned it, Sarah mentioned it, the mass spec will almost always give you the wrong ratio, right? This is a way to normalize to what we think is a correct ratio based on ID10's data. And so we use that fractionation factor to bring everything back to what we would consider the right age. I include thorium on here, thorium lead, so 232, 238, and it's going to look like, it's actually not too terrible, but a lot of fractionation. No, for zircon, thorium, we don't even really use this ever, but if you're using, if you're looking at other accessory minerals, then you might want to think about like thorium-rich minerals. Right. 238, 206, 238, that's the one you really want to monitor, because that's going to tell you how your mass spec's behaving, because 238 it's a fickle beast. It's a lot harder to measure than, say, lead and lead. On the top right here, we have a general analytical session window. So by default, it plots your primary standards, which, because everything's normalized to that primary standard, this is an important plot, but perhaps not as important as your secondary standards. So if you click on the checkbox for secondaries, what you can see is that, well, okay, if we take a secondary reference material that we've characterized well, and we treat it as an unknown, how good are we doing? So I'd say that this is one of the most important plots that anybody could ever look at. If and when you go to someone's lab, if you go to LaserCon, if you go anywhere, you want to see the secondary reference material. Many people say you need a tertiary reference material, one old, one young, because this really tells you how you do. It's an independent check on how you do. Because if you're getting the wrong age on something you treated as an unknown, how can you trust any of the other data, right? And so this pulls off of Concordia a little bit, and that's because of how we are applying this common lead correction. So you can turn this knob and bring these back onto Concordia, and that would be one of the kind of fine-tuning points that you would do. And we can talk about that toward the end. There's some other kind of fun plots here. You can plot all of the unknowns. Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, what's the difference between the primary and secondary reference material? The primary are what are plotted with these blue diamonds here. This is what you're actually correcting to. If you zoom in real close, you'll find some of these have not 5 unknowns, but 7 in between. And that's because we threw a couple of secondary standards in there, and we just treated them like they're unknowns as a monitor, as a verification that we're doing things. How's the session going? Because if say you go to the secondaries that you treated as unknowns that have been normalized to those primary reference materials, and they're 100 million years off, you say, hey, timeout, like what is going on? And that has happened dozens of times. My tenure at LaserCon, sometimes you'll go down for days because you'll find out that something's very, very wrong.
This is probably the IP.
100%, yeah. This is when we find out that things are not working the way they should be. And, if these aren't right, then what are you even doing, right? Like, how can you trust the unknowns that you're trying to interpret geologically? Cool. That answer, yeah. Okay, I see you, yeah. Okay, you can also plot all of your unknowns. And so this is a really well-behaved sample. Again, you can use some of these tools in the top left and zoom in to the Concordia line and see just how close onto that Concordia you're doing. So on the x-axis is your 7.5 ages, your y-axis are 206, 238 ages. And so this is a nice, well-behaved sample. But in this sample, there are some that are, I apologize to those with color blindness, but some are red and some are blue. So this one out here, why do you think that was rejected if it's in red? What's wrong with this analysis down here? Yeah, so super discordant, right? What about this one here? Let's zoom in a little bit more. What's wrong with this one? There are a couple of things wrong with that one. Why would you maybe not hang your entire thesis on that sample? Reversely discordant. How about the size of that error ellipse? It's pretty big, right? And so one thing you can do is like, well, you know, what if that was incorporated and accepted? You can start changing some of these filters. You can change that filter, hit re-reduce. It starts it from a clean slate from raw data, and you can, you know, depending on what the scientific question is, you can refine your data set to fit that question and test what you're trying to test. Maybe having a lot of reverse discordant dates is a bad thing in your case. Usually it is. But if you wanted a looser filter because you have, say, some very, very old dates, some very, very old zircons that have been around for a long time, had a lot of time to become metamict or other sort of issues, you might want looser filters. It all depends on what you're trying to do, right? So you can click through this and say accepted only. You can only look at the rejected and say, well, hey, so this guy out here, obviously he's he's definitely needs to be rejected. Very, very discordant. These ones down here, probably rejected based on, you know, they're still older than 600 million years, so probably discordance or uncertainty depending. There's some other fun plots here, so you can look at age versus uranium concentration to look for trends. You know, if you're interested in maximum depositional age, you might want to do this. So lots of kind of interactive tools that, you know, George had a lot of these things built in Excel over the years, but it's hard for people to learn where all the little tabs are and all of these things. So when I met George, he said, hey, that'd be really cool if you can turn this into a program. And that's what we have now.
Higher uranium concentration with younger ages. If you want to use that for maximum depositional age or single youngest range. So we should see a trend when you've got age versus uranium concentration.
This one.
You're going to younger ages, you're getting higher uranium concentration. What might that mean, guys? I mean, you've got some mud walks. So would you want to use those youngest ages for an maximum depositional age? With myself? No, run for the hills.
Run away. Yeah, so the discussion for those joining virtually was whether or not you should trust dates. If you're interested in maximum depositional age, what if those youngest dates had very high uranium concentration? And the short answer is, whoa, red flags, right? Because you might have a lot of lead loss because of that. Cool, so I'm gonna move on to the bottom left here. And this is a little panel that really allows you to look at each individual analysis by itself, right? So Sarah showed a nice plot where basically you measure background. Here on the x-axis we have time, so for about 10 seconds we measure background, and then we start firing the laser, and then we start measuring. In magenta here is 238, cyan, if you can see it, is 232, and so on. So you can, all of this is interactive, right? You can turn on and off different, say you only wanted to look at your mercury and your mercury concentration for whatever reason. Maybe you suspect something, there's some contamination issue. You can click through your samples and see, are these normal values that I would typically see coming out of my helium, which oftentimes can contain some mercury. And so here we see the session was generally running pretty good that day. Or if you wanted to look at very specific specific things, but not in a log scale, you can turn the log off and you can see that the 238 just absolutely dominates, right? As it should. It's definitely the highest abundance for what we measure. And so some interactive tools there and a way to quality check or QC your data grain by grain. The ones that are in red, it tells you why they were rejected. So you can actually check and see what was wrong with different dates. So here you can see, well, rejected, it's discordant, it has high 204. If I toggle on and off that 204, you can see that, whoa, that if you were at LaserCon for a couple of days and running, you would see that and say, whoa, that's no way. We don't want that in our sample. Like, I'm not going to make a geologic interpretation based on something that has that much 204. Okay, so there was some discussion on how to plot your data. So this is, and as Wei mentioned earlier, this is really, if you're doing detrital work, this is how you look at your data. You know, this it's one thing to look at a Concordia plot of a detrital sample, which this is, and so I can plot that up here. That's not as easy to interpret as, say, either a histogram, so just a general histogram, a probability density plot, or a kernel density estimate. I'll talk about the difference between these in just a sec. But for me, you know, there's, like in all healthy science, there's a pretty big debate over some nuance, right? And one of the biggest debates is whether a probability density plot is an appropriate way to look at your data. There's a lot of research on this. Peter Vermeesch in 2012 brought kernel density estimates to the table and said, hey, you know, this is probability density plots actually don't have any statistical basis. They don't have any underlying statistical basis. And he's right, they don't. But they are a very effective tool to look at your data, in my opinion. I personally use kernel density estimates nowadays for reasons that we'll talk about later, because when you start using quantitative analysis and doing quantitative comparisons, there are some serious issues with PDPs, which you can see very clearly here. And this is a big point that Peter makes in his 2012 papers, says this can lead to misleading results. Look at this highest peak here is only high because that Gaussian that it's based on was really, really narrow. It's like, okay, well, yeah, but it's not about the height of the peak, it's about the area under the curve. These are normalized to 1. And so I encourage you to read that paper and see for yourself or make a decision for yourself. But I agree, I think this leads to misleading results, where you have very spiky young dates and very kind of more washed out dates with the older part of the spectrum. The exact opposite occurs when the plots that Wei showed, where you get these washed out kind of over smoothing of the KDE. And absolutely that is the trade-off. And so the idea is just to visualize your data best you can, right? So there's no hard and tried and true cookbook on doing this. These are just decisions you have to make. Sometimes a cumulative plot I find to be even really useful. So the cumulative distribution functions, those are really nice, which I don't have coded into this right now. So by default, I just have everything plotted up, because even an old school histogram, nothing wrong with that, right? You're just trying to figure out which populations you have and which you don't. Most questions in detrital geochronology are about presence and absence. These quantitative tools that I'll talk about in a little bit, they're really for more nuanced questions. For the KDE and PDP, the main difference here, so PDP, what it does is it takes each individual age and your analytical uncertainty and makes a Gaussian out of that, and then adds all of those up. So your younger dates will always have, most of the time, always have a smaller uncertainty because it scales with age. So these are going to be spikier, these are going to be washed out because the uncertainty in the older side of the spectrum is higher. That's just a natural thing that's going to happen with just the nature of the analysis. What a KDE does is you can do this in 2 ways. One, you can set the quote kernel, which stands in place of your uncertainty. And you say that, well, let's make everything regardless of age have the same kernel, the same uncertainty. And you can change that, right? So if I make this a really big kernel, and this should be pretty interactive. So if it's working for you, just type in maybe 50 million years, and you can see you start to wash out that spectrum, right? So you can over smooth it that way. You know, if I go just completely crazy, like, hey, let's start making interpretations on that curve, right? So that would be over smooth, in my opinion. You could also go under smoothed, right? So now the uncertainty is 1 million years for every single date. Well, that's not very good either. So another approach to this, you can use an algorithm that will say, hey, based on your data density, like, okay, here at around 1,300 million years, 1,200 is got a healthy granular signal. You know, it's going to take the data density and say, what's the best kernel for this entire data set? And so you can click on an optimized kernel. And here it's saying 38 million years is the best kernel. And this is based on a diffusion algorithm that really has nothing to do with the trittle geochronology. There are other ways that Peter Vermeesch and others have made an adaptive kernel where they say, well, let's make it vary based on data density, which is another way. But all of the ways in a kernel density estimate are not based on your analytical uncertainty. That's the main difference. And so there, again, it's healthy science, raging debate on this topic. Some people are diehard KDE people and some people are diehard PDP. I'm somewhere in between. You know, it depends on what you're doing. But I like to give the people, you know, that's the other thing the LaserCon Center is not about, is policing people's interpretations. You know, Mark mentioned that we have 130 publications a year. We're not on those papers. That we don't contribute to the science. We're not on the papers publishing unless we contribute in a major way. You can imagine there's only a handful of us. There's no way we could ever take part in everybody else's research. So that number 130 is really just for data that come from LaserCon. So we're not about policing anything. So when I built this, I said, hey, whatever you want, I should put some CDFs in there too and make everybody happy. But yeah, however people want to plot their data, yeah, fine by me, right? But the debate rages on. Anyways, the other thing this program can do, if you want to make plots, you can export this plot and pull this into Adobe Illustrator, or if you're a Corel Draw type person, you can do that too. You can file save as an EPS file or a TIFF, and very easily pull that into Illustrator as a vector image and make your figures that way. So all of these plots, so if somebody, you know, you submit your data for publication, they say, hey, I want to see that fractionation plot. You get a real stickler, like, oh, I need that fractionation plot. You can go to your sample, reload it, and say, here you go. Looks great. Or, yeah, it looks okay. A little bit of positive drift. It's fine. It's fine. And that's basically the program. Yeah, you can. And the way you do that is with these interactive tools. In other versions, I think for the E2, I actually put in text boxes or edit boxes where you can set your axes. But the other programs that are in HCalc, so these guys, these analysis tools, basically plotting tools, those have more capability for that. Most of these are just default. Basically, it takes whatever the max is for a histogram and then adds one. Just a way to maximize what you're actually seeing. Cool. So are there questions on this? That was probably a lot. We're going there next. Yeah, that's it. So the question for the folks virtually is how does increasing the number of analyses per sample or session, measurement session, affect this? And the short answer is it doesn't. If you, in Excel, it would be a nightmare, put it that way. Because you need to go through and do a common lead correction for every single age. If you're doing a downhole correction, every single thing has to happen for every grain, right? And so if you have 1,200 analyses that you did in an hour, oh, it's pretty taxing on Excel. It'll crash it pretty easily. Same thing, even with plotting a probability density plot, the number of calculations that go into that, you have to make an individual Gaussian curve from 0 to 4 billion years. Depending on your interval, that's 4,000, probably at minimum. If you want a finer, you know, if you zoom into one of these curves, You say, well, that's looking a little too spiky for me, you know, if it's supposed to be rounded off. Let me show you an example. So here, if I zoom way in on this, probability density plots, can everybody see how that's kind of angular? That's because there's only one point. It's not a function, it's a plot of points. So every single point has to be accounted for. So you make a Gaussian curve for every age, and if you have 100 ages, that's 100 Gaussians times 4,000 points. Or if you make that interval every 0.5 million years, it's like you can see how it gets exponential, right? And so it's not necessarily the reduction that'll fail, it's the plotting that'll struggle. Early plotting programs, like George wrote an early one in HCalc, I think it was limited to like 1,000 ages. It's like, oh, maybe someday, right? Peter Vermeer's density plotter, I think initially was limited to 1,000 because nobody saw this coming, right? Like how fast we would be able to go and how people would want more and more data. So yeah, it's really in the plotting, but still the reduction would struggle as well. Good question. Any other questions out there? It's hard to gauge people in masks. It's better than like, you know, it's hard to gauge a void in Zoom. So apologies to those of you joining virtually, but it's just as difficult in some ways. I can't tell if people are like, I have no idea what's going on. Cool. So we ready to save some data? Maybe show you a global database. Cool. So you can do this two ways. You can either save things individually, like an individual data table, a detailed data table that will include all of the nitty gritty stuff that you would ever want. If any of you have seen lasercron data, this would be like sheet one. This is your sheet one. The infamous sheet one has all of the calculations in it. The session, save session, will actually save an instance of your session. So if you save that session and then 5 years later, you're like, what filters did I use? You could load that back up or open it up in MATLAB by its root source. There's a lot of ways to get the filters back out. It's a way to just kind of keep track of what you actually did, because I know I can't remember things that are going to happen today by tomorrow. Then the minders in the lab, myself included, I was working down there, like, you know, I just want everything saved right off the bat. I don't want to type in what it's going to be called. I just want it to be systematic. If you hit the save all button, what that's going to do is it's going to go take the directory that you loaded your data from, and it's just going to save everything and dump it back in that place, all named for you. Yeah. Yes, that was a new addition for the new. Yes, sorry for those of you who are working on the 2021. Mark in the new lab said, I want this. And I said, okay, Mark, you're in charge. Sarah asked for it way earlier than that in the E2 lab. Like, we need a save all button. Okay, I'll give you a save all button. So all you're really gonna need, for those of you working in 2018 or who are just against the save all button, there are people out there, there are dozens. Use the data table option, and this is going to be your simplified table. So actually, I'm going to do that just to show. So test, and if you're on a Mac, you don't want to save it to the HD; it won't go in there. So I'm just going to dump it on the desktop. And I'm going to save that, and hopefully Excel's working today. So, and then open that up. And then this is going to be a simplified data table. And it always puts it way out here. You might have to zoom out on your Excel sheet, because it always, with the citations here, it'll it'll make this second column really, really wide. So I'm going to zoom in here and talk about this stuff. So how does it look from back there, Sarah? Folks, sort of, any tables out there open? I see one thumbs up. I'll take it. 2 thumbs up, 3. So let me go back to the program just for those, so I can show it again just in case. So oops. I'm not going to save it twice, but I just clicked on this data table button here. Okay, thank you. Okay, so what we're going to do now is add some metadata. And so what you want to do is say, okay, give the aliquot a name. This is obviously just for fun, and we're going to load it to kind of my dummy account on Geochron. I'm going to say, okay, test sample. You can name it a fun name, like maybe awesome sample. I'm going to ignore stratigraphic formation. Some of this metadata I'm going to ignore just for the sake of time. But all of this would be important metadata, right? Very important. What you're going to want to put in there is some sort of lat long. I'm going to put in my default, which is always 12.34567. And then for longitude, 123.4567, because that puts you in Southeast Asia and there's like no data in the database there. So I know if it worked whenever I'm teaching this short course. If you want to pull up Google Earth and find a spot, or maybe plot it right up in here, but there's some parts of the database that have a lot of data. So if you want to see if your data plotted or not, you'll have to pick a coordinate, maybe pick your favorite one from your thesis or something, your dissertation. So you'll need to put some sort of lat long in decimal degrees there. And analysis purpose, I'm going to write capital detrital, capital zircon. The database seems to like that version of it. You can put your name in there, and all of this. If this was real data for your thesis that you were uploading, you would want to do that. But for now, I'm just going to save it as is and go to geochron.org. So the lat long is really what I needed to add in there, and the detrital zircon. So geochron.org, if you have an account, that's awesome. If you don't, I'm going to go to geochron.org. And click on that big contribute data button. And so Doug Walker and Jason Ash and the Geochron folks were kind enough to add this HCalc ML button here. And so the link, if you click on the big zircon that's getting ablated, that's going to take you to lasertron.org. It's going to take you to lasertron.org. What you want to click on is this manual upload using XLS. And that'll take you to something like this. Let me log out, and so I can show you how to log in using my account. And so what it'll take you to a place that looks like this. If you don't have a GeoPass, it actually only takes 15, 20 seconds to make a GeoPass, but since we're using dummy data, let's not fill the database. Let's put stuff in the database that I can delete later. So you can use my my dummy account. So it's just sundell@email.arizona.edu. Can anybody guess the password? It's not space. What's the best mineral in the world? So the password is zircon, all lowercase. Yeah, it's really, I mean, case sensitive. But yeah, so the email address again is sundell@email.arizona.edu. And the password is zircon. Cool. And so what you should find is this, or if you're still on the submit data part of the page, you want to click on manual upload using HCalc ML and choose file. And so what you want to do is go find, what did I name that thing? Test. I think I named it test. So make sure you pick the right file and then open. And then there's a big question. This is a big community discussion right now. Whether to overwrite your data, that's not the discussion. It's whether or not to make your data public right away. And so what a lot of folks do, a big concern with people doing science is whether or not you're going to get scooped. What I found in the geochronology community, this doesn't happen very often. People are pretty much above board. It's a good group of people. Like nobody's out trying to steal other people's research and publish it before them. Sure, it might happen sometimes, but in general, I don't find it to be a big deal. Working at LaserCron, Sarah would probably say the same thing. This is kind of a non-issue for what we do. But the concern is very real. So a lot of folks want to, quote, embargo their data until it's published. What Geochron does is it says, hey, it's your data, you do whatever you want. So make it public, yay or nay. If you're comfortable with putting it out there, there are benefits to that. So, if I saw some data that was out in some area that had nothing ever published, I would click on it like, who's working out there? Oh, they loaded this in 2021. I would seek them out if I'm really interested in this place, right? I think it can be a collaborative tool to publish without embargo. But if you're afraid, like, hey, I have this really high profile thing, I don't want anybody to know about it yet, by all means, embargo it, right? The idea is at some point along the way, please put it on into a database, because most of us have made a compilation at some point in our lives, and it's time consuming, right? And so we've all collectively reinvented that wheel over and over and over. George talked about the Sparrow group. They're doing a lot of work with a lot of different labs to try to make this easier. Geochron was way ahead of the game on this, and so they started building this database years ago. And so the idea is, the big push is to get people to load their data to it. Anyways, so I always say yes, but if you haven't published it, you might want to say no. Overwrite is if I've already loaded test, it's going to overwrite it. Yeah, so there shouldn't be anything unless folks have already uploaded to this. But I'm going to say no, because I don't think it's in there unless everybody named it test. Then hit submit, and then there's your data. Should say success. There's all your metadata that I ignored. And then this is now available to the public.
So I get an is not readable.
Is not readable.
And it's weird because it says the file name Helios temp 14.
Oh yeah. So the issue, I'm just going to show folks what happened there, because I think I know. Yeah, so the wrong data reduction was selected. So there's all kinds of different data that this database takes in. It's dominantly uranium lead, but there is argon data. There's other types of data, uranium, thorium, helium, so thermochronometric data is in there. So lots of stuff. Is it connected to StravaSpot? I don't know. I know that folks are working on that. The idea is to, I don't even know if it's connected to MacroStrat yet. I think that would be really powerful. Strabo, because it's the same group of people with Doug and everybody. I actually don't know the answer to that. It's a good question. I can find out. Absolutely. Yeah, so the discussion for the virtual folks, is this connected to StravaSpot? I don't know the answer to that. If somebody does, George might know. Because yeah, the idea is that it would save a ton of time in terms of metadata. Yeah, absolutely.
This does have a view function.
Yeah, so that's where we're going. So now what you can do is go to search Geochron, or you can just go to Geochron here, search data, or search detrital search if you did if you did include detrital zircon as your analytical purpose, you can go find it now. And so my test sample should live, I see somebody's out in Southeast Asia as well. I always go too fast with this interface. So yeah, click. There's a lot of data in here, so it has to load it every time you click. And so yeah, I'm gonna zoom in slowly. What you can do is go find your sample. I think we're right on top of each other. And so awesome sample. Somebody else also did awesome sample. I like it. ZZZZZZ. So yeah, you can go in and get the details on this sample, and you can actually just go and download that data right away. And so you can imagine how powerful this tool is, right? So if you wanted this data, you can just download it. And so as far as, saving people time with not reinventing the wheel, I think especially like kind of the age of big data, there's a lot of discussion about this sort of thing. This is where it's heading, right? So it's a lot of people doing a lot of really cool science. Making that aspect more accessible, I think, is a positive move. I'm going to stop there for Geochron stuff and HCalc stuff and take a breather. So maybe questions, discussion, thoughts, folks out in Zoom land, concerns. I see hands. I saw your hand first, then we'll go back in the back. Yeah.
So this is kind of neither here nor there for you exactly, but about the Geochron database. How do we vet the reliability of all of this data? I mean, it's the same questions you get from other big data. I mean,
Yeah.
There's a lot of garbage out there.
Yeah, so the question is about how do we vet the data?
I mean, how do we guarantee that somebody's not going to get our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7?
I know. Yeah, how do we know that the metadata?
A bunch of samples.
How do we know that the lab was, doing well that day? It really kind of comes down to a philosophical question. This is a big discussion in the kind of cyber infrastructure community. There's kind of two schools of thought. There's a lot of thought on it, but if I could break it down into two schools of thought. One is more data means that good data will outweigh the bad. And it's like, okay, that I could see the arguments for that. And the other school of thought is the exact opposite. The more data is in there, garbage in, garbage out, you're going to end up with too much bad data. Some of these databases, not Geochron, but Geochronorg, for example, is enormous. And just like Geochron, there's nobody policing this thing, to my knowledge. You don't know. So what I do when I go putting together compilations for whatever I'm trying to test, I'll pull the Geochron database if I'm working, say, in a certain part of North America. I'll pull it all, and I'll look at the citations. So there's supposed to be a citation associated with each one. And usually if you're in the community, especially if you're in long enough, you start to know people, and you know who to trust and who, if you don't know them, maybe look into the lab, look at where the data was produced. Yeah, because you can imagine the data that go into Geochron are not they're at a somewhat granular level. You have error correlations, you have uncertainties, you have some of the analytical stuff, but we didn't upload sheet 1, right? There's too much data there for a very specific lab. No, you can imagine including everything at a granular level is a much bigger task, and that's what the Sparrow group is really doing. They're trying to bring it to a more granular level and tap into individual labs that are kind of power producers, as I would call them.
Most of what's uploaded to geochronorg is exactly the same as what you would find in a data table. If somebody that has published out of our lab, this is exactly what they have published. This is the data table that most
Yes,
of our
except this hasn't gone to the data table that goes in you could say, the data table in a published article has been vetted and peer reviewed, and that version that's published, there might be mistakes in it, but if somebody has at least looked at it and said this is legitimate data, this is not necessarily. We could put this out there today and make it public and leave it there, and it's there until somebody discovers that we're.
Yeah.
Totally, and so then probably would only want to pull things that are citable, and that's just,
Right,
that
but
would
you could
probably-
even add a full citation,
Yeah, yeah.
this is from, Garrels et al. 1997, and it's not. I'm not that. That would be malicious, and that's a different thing than kind of poor data. But
I feel like there's very few malicious folks in the geo. Like, we're nerdy enough to where there are other things that malicious people want to
No,
do.
I agree.
But,
I can't imagine what the motivation, but a lot of people.
yeah.
You don't have to be in the Geochron community to put stuff in here. You could be.
Yeah.
A Russian hacker who,
Yeah, if they had it out
for
for
whatever reason wants to sabotage Geochron.
yeah, if they had it out for us poor geochronologists, then we're doomed. But so there is an aliquot reference here. So sometimes it'll say not published or NA or in review if people are really on top of it. in reality, and building on what Sarah said, what you can do, and I encourage this, we encourage this at the lab, is use this as your supplemental data. Instead of, some journals, they don't even want to host anymore. They just want to say, no, use a different source, use an Opto or whatever that other, use some other database. If you say, hey, my stuff's on geochron.org, you can go look at it right now. Reviewers will be like, that's great, and they'll go to it. Or if they're not really the in the weeds type people, they won't. The point is, it's in a place and it's safe, and it's not going to get lost, not like it always gets lost in a journal, but sometimes it does. Or the data gets updated post-review, which you can update it here. Sometimes people don't update those supplemental files after review. It happens.
And the counter argument is it's kind of the almost raw data as opposed to data that's been reduced to the point where you can't really tell what the underlying fact is.
Yeah, my go-to is nowadays, what I recommend to people is to upload your data to Geochron, put it in review, trust that nobody's going to steal it, and tell the reviewers that this is where it lives and this is a safe place for it. It's not relying on the journal, because again, a lot of the journals are walking away from that responsibility because it's a huge undertaking, right? It's expensive. We're working on that connection. The question is, can we download directly from Geochron? We had a proposal out to do that. It did not get funded to do that to build that connection. It didn't get funded. We're going to keep trying. Anyways, I should probably move on to, what do you think? So I have until 2:30 to get through. Let's do DZ stats. Sound good? How will that be for scheduling? If I'm done by 2:30? Okay.
Yeah, Kurt, I wouldn't worry too much about the time. We can kind of condense the lutetium, hafnium, trace element stuff just to kind of fill in whatever time we have. So I would say do what you think is best.
Okay, cool. I appreciate that. Thank you both. Cool. And so for folks, if I'm going to stick around at the end, for those of you who are here, we can chat about this more. I'm happy to do that. Always like stay here till midnight talking about data reduction. Like I said, it's the most exciting thing we're going to do all day. As you saw, there's socks everywhere. No, yeah. So by all means, I'll be here. So we can chat more if anybody's really interested or has burning questions. But I will move on now to quantitative comparisons. I'm going to present a little 5-minute presentation because quantitative comparison kind of came up in one of the modules. George, can you see, is this sharing properly? Can you see this? Okay, cool. Thank you. So yeah, in Way's presentation, this came up just very briefly with the KS test. The KS test is one of many different measures of similarity that you can apply to detrital geochronology data. There's been a tiny explosion of of new methods that have come out. This is a very active field of research. How best to compare, say, and I apologize to those who have color blindness, but the red taller curve and the shorter blue curve. What's the best way to put a number on that comparison right there? So I'm going to present just very, very briefly what are the different ways that are commonly used now, and a couple of caveats to them. So we talked about probability density plots. Here's a nice example of how old dates have a wider uncertainty, a larger uncertainty, so a wider, flatter Gaussian. The younger dates will have a spikier, narrow Gaussian. And this is what one of the issues with the PDP is. These will be very spiky in the young age spectrum and very washed out in the old. So you can use a KDE, and I would actually encourage everybody to use KDEs when doing quantitative comparisons, but that's a whole different short course that I will be helping teach tomorrow. Alternatively, you can look at this as a cumulative distribution. If you've ever looked at a cumulative distribution very closely, they're actually little stair steps. So everywhere that you have a date, you add a step. So you have a step here, step here, step here. And I think I overlaid these. Yeah. So you have step here, step here, step here. So all the way. So going from 0 to 1, so 33%, 0.3% probability that things are younger than right here, that are younger than this, probably 250 million years. So CDFs are a very useful way of looking at these data, these kinds of data. But what happens if you have two wiggles and you want to quantitatively assess how similar they are? I mentioned this earlier, but just to drive the point home, PDPs and KDEs, these are not functions. They're just discrete sets of points. They're univariate data, so one-dimensional data. They're just a string of numbers plotted. We plot them as lines, but really they're points. Them being points is very, very useful for quantitative analysis. So George was one of the first people to look into this. He calculates what he calls similarity. This actually comes from a paper in the 1940s. The Bhattacharya distance is what this is actually based on. So this pops up in all kinds of different fields. I actually don't know. I think it's pure stats where Bhattacharya distance comes from. But George said, well, hey, what if, well, if we plot these in a similar fashion, so, okay, make a probability density plot 0 to 2,500 million years, put 1 point at every 1 million years. And well, if these are identical, if we multiply, call red F and blue G, call them functions, discretized functions. If we multiply red with blue, red with blue, red with blue for every point along this, and then take the square root, that's what's called a geometric mean, right? And then sum those up, that's going to give you a number between 0 and 1. And that should correspond to how similar these things are. So 0, S of 0 would be completely different. They look completely different. They don't overlap at all. If they were identical, S would be 1. So it's a numerical assessment of how similar F and G are in this case. So you can imagine if you pull the whole Geochron database and compare everything to everything, you don't want to look at every single plot, right? This would be a way to tell a computer to say, hey, compare these 50 samples with these other 50 samples, which is exactly what we're going to do in DZ stats. So that's one way. Likeness is another way. Basically here, all we're doing is we're just saying, well, let's take every point that's blue and every point that's red, take their difference, their absolute difference, sum that up, divide it by half, and subtract it from 1. This is really, these details are really just to fit it into a 0 to 1 sort of range. And so here the likeness is what they would call this. Sapkowski took what was initially called mismatch, which is just this component of it, which came out earlier by Will Amadon, who was another pioneer in this field. And he said, well, it's more intuitive if you go 0 to 1 with 0 being a misfit. So likeness is 0 to 1, where like similarity, a 1 is a perfect fit and a 0 is completely different. Again, just a numerical assessment. Then my PhD advisor, Joel Saylor, came along and he said, well, why don't we just cross plot them? Why don't we take all of the reds, you know, they all plot along the same line. Let's just cross plot the reds versus the blues. And you get these weird plots. He was doing his postdoc at the time. I remember he went to Brian Horton, who was Sarah's advisor. He said, what if we called them butterfly plots? And he's like, I don't think that's going to fly, because oftentimes these will get really weird looking. But the point is, if you plot these against one another, if they were an identical match, you would get a cross correlation, just an R squared of 1. These are super different, right? And so you see you get an R squared closer to 0. Like all things, a lot of people argue whether or not this is a good idea to do. These other techniques, so Peter Vermeesch has a recent paper on the pros and cons. My PhD advisor and I have a paper out there on pros and cons of these different methods. So yeah, it's all debated. CDFs, another way you can assess similarity. If you just subtract one from the other, that's the D value. So that's what Wei showed in one of her plots. The chaos test was initially really designed, I think in the 50s, 60s to be a hypothesis test. So what the p-value does in a KS test is it says, okay, well, let's calculate p, just the maximum difference between these two curves, and stick that into an empirically, I think it's empirically derived equation that'll spit out a hypothesis test, a binary hypothesis test of, is it some percent probable, usually 95% probable, that these came from different distributions or the same distribution. What we find, and we can demonstrate this using some of this new software, p-values are not well suited for detrital geochronology. You'll see p-value tables sometimes. I would treat them with extreme caution. Most people agree that you shouldn't be using these in detrital geochronology. They're not well suited for a bunch of reasons that Ramesh's 2013 paper goes over. But we can talk about those at the end too. The d-value, however, just this general like subtraction of one minus the other, this tends to work really well. So a d-value looks great. If you see p-values, I would, again, treat it with caution. I'm not trying to call out publications, but they can be very misleading because it's not an assessment of similarity, it's a hypothesis test that's not well suited to detrital geochronology. Basically, it's the sample size that's the big issue. The Kuiper test is basically the KS test, but it says, hey, well, let's subtract red from blue and then blue from red and add those together. And so it's a little more complicated, but not much. But they call that a V value. They got that in the 1960s. The benefit to the Kuiper test is it's not sensitive to the tails anymore. You can imagine most of your data is probably going to let out here, not always in the tails. So the KS test is more, it's biased toward the median, the middle of the data. Whereas the Kuiper test is equally sensitive along X. So I would argue it's a better metric because of that. And I think most people are on board with that. Again, don't use p-values for a Kuiper test. It's kind of it's a bad idea because you'll get misleading results when you start thinking about geology. This will be on the drive. I added some references there, and the papers will be on the drive as well. I don't think they're on there yet, but I'll put them on there. So are there questions on that? So really quick intro on a lot of information, but. How dare you ask me that? The question was if I had to pick one. Oh gosh. Like everything in geoscience, it depends. How's that for a non-answer? No, they have their pros and cons. Our 2016 paper goes and tests these things to the nth degree. Cross correlation is more aggressive. Similarity I like because it's simple. And likeness, like similarity is pretty simple. I actually really like all of these. I do them all, kind of like the max depo ages. Do them all. If they all come out wildly different, but not systematically different, you might have some issues. And we're going to talk about that in this next part when we start using the DZ stats program. And a slideshow. Okay, so yeah, this will be on the drive, and like data reduction, I am happy to stay here all night and talk about it after the short course. But for now, let's dive into the DZ stats